Hello and welcome back to the Nasty Metal Productions channel here at YouTube, and welcome to another Album of the Week video. This is episode number 239. And so for today's episode, I am celebrating the 50th anniversary of Burn, the classic 8th studio album for the legendary Deep Purple. Originally released on February 15th, 1974 via both their Purple Records label, EMI, and the Warner Bros. Label. So, with all that said, let's begin. By the time the band's 7th studio album, Who Do We Think We Are, was released, it was met with polarizing opinions from critics and fans alike. Even the band itself, besides giving out a hit single and Woman from Tokyo, claiming that the management was pushing them to forcefully complete the album before the tour, very much like what happened with Fireball. But on top of this was also the growing tensions between Gillan and Blackmore. And by the summer of 1973, Gillan would quit the band after the second tour of Japan, with even bass player Roger Glover being dismissed by the insistence of Blackmore. Therefore, the Mark II lineup was no more. Afterward, they would hire ex-Trapeze member Glenn Hughes, who not only would be their new bass player, but also become a major part vocally as well. According to Pace, Glover told him and Lord a few months before his official termination that he wanted to leave the band. So they had started to drop in on Trapeze shows. After acquiring Hughes, they debated continuing as a quartet, with Hughes as a bassist and lead vocalist. According to Hughes, he was told the band was bringing in Paul Rodgers of Free fame as a co-lead vocalist, but by that time, Rodgers had just started Bad Company, though hadn't released anything because this is still 1973 and not yet 74. According to Paul Rodgers, he is, again to quote him here, "They did ask, and I spoke to all of them at length about the possibility. Purple had toured Australia with Free's final lineup. I didn't do it because I was very much into the idea of forming Bad Company." And so there you have it. Those came out of the words of Paul Rodgers. And now because of this, auditions were held for lead vocal replacements. From these auditions, a very young, bluesy singer named David Coverdale, an unknown from Saltburn in northeast England, primarily because Blackmore liked his masculine, blues-tinged voice. And from there, the Mark III lineup was born. This lineup of the band would begin recording for their new album at Montreux, Switzerland in November 1973. Again, using the Rolling Stones mobile studio with Martin Birch back as a main engineer and mixer, with the band producing themselves once again, and technically for the final time, until possibly the reunion album or the Mark II reunion album in '84, Perfect Strangers. The band would record about 9 tracks, however, with ultimately 8 being chosen, leaving out the somewhat cool rocking, funky instrumental Coronarius Redig in favor of another instrumental, which I'll get to when I get into my thoughts of the album. So with the addition of David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes, Purple's hard rock sound became more boogie-oriented, incorporating elements of soul and funk, which would become much more prominent for the next 2 albums. And so finally, by February 15th, 1974, Burn was born and ushered in, though, again, the rather short-lived Mark III lineup. So, with featuring 8 tracks, clocking at the length of 42 minutes and 15 seconds, these 8 tracks are, kicking off at the fiery title track, then into Might Just Take Your Life, Lay Down, Stay Down, Sail Away, You Fool No One, What's Going On Here, Mistreated, and then ending with A200, which is the lone instrumental for the album, and the one that, which I'll eventually get into, was chosen over Coronarius Redig. So there you go, folks. There's your 8 tracks for the Stone Cold classic, Burn. So with Burn introducing the world to the brand new Mark III lineup, some of the core fan base was practically skeptical of this, to the point where they weren't very much supportive of it, to even just not even at times accepting Glenn Hughes as a co-lead singer, let alone the very young David Coverdale. But once these fans at least got to hear Burn, well, practically most of that faded away, even if it meant letting go of such a charismatic singer that Ian Gillan was. Now, I've been into Deep Purple for most of my life, with a dad who cited them as one of his all-time favorite bands, especially with Ritchie Blackmore being one of his all-time favorite guitar players. So, he always would play Deep Purple for me at a very, very young age. But when I first got to listen to Burn, which was by the mid-2000s, it took me by surprise, mostly due to the dynamics and vocal performances between Coverdale and Hughes. Now, I may have heard the live recordings from the Come Taste the Band era first, but that's sort of fuzzy to me. Anyways, over time I warmed up to this album, and I now put it next to juggernauts like Deep Purple and Rock and Machine Head. What separates this album somewhat from the previous 3 bangers, meaning Deep Purple and Rock, Fireball, and Machine Head, is the fusion of funk and soul with the heavy rock of the past classics. Now, there is some of that heaviness there, like with the title track, but even within the title track, there is that sort of soulful dynamic that has been added in, which is all thanks to Glenn Hughes. But even John Lord has switched things from the classic Hammond organ to a traditional keyboard with synthesizers, which would become more prominent during the rest of Deep Purple's time and as well into his time with Whitesnake. But as for the rest of the album, it goes from rocker to even some funky numbers, again mixing things up, like the dynamic between Lay Down, Stay Down and Sail Away. Lay Down, Stay Down is a straight up boogie rocker with a killer groove to it, but then when Sail Away comes after it, it's now getting into funky territory. It's pretty heavy in delivery, but the crux of it is funk, with Blackmore strutting in that raunchy guitar riff with John Lord's synth keynotes and Glenn Hughes driving bass with Ian Pace just hammering it all home, creating a hypnotic rhythm, and between both David Coverdale and Glenn Hughes taking turns singing with both their bluesy and soaring melodic vocal melodies, this proved to be a tour de force. Now there still is at least one other hard rocker here, which is You Fool No One, which isn't nearly as heavy in its attack like compared to Burn or even the boogie nature of Lay Down, Stay Down, but it does have a massive hook to it and a driving groove, which serves as a secret weapon. Then there are the two lighter rockers like Might Just Take Your Life and What's Going On Here, which aren't nearly on the same level of intensity as a title track or You Fool No One or anywhere near the booginess of Lay Down, Stay Down. But they are catchy, with fusing in those soulful bluesy vibes that was obviously brought in by both Coverdale and Hughes, and that's why they are quite infectious on their own. Then we finally have the rather epic Coverdale and Blackmore blues pen track, Mistreated, which is a fantastic track with plenty of those trademark Blackmore licks and bluesy guitar playing that is purely emotional, with Coverdale giving out a great performance that gave you an insight into how much of a powerhouse that he would eventually rise up to. Of course, this track would then live on past Purple with Coverdale and Whitesnake, Dio, and Glenn Hughes being used in their respective set lists for future shows. Finally, the album ends with an instrumental named A200. This was favored over the other instrumental that was Coronarius Red Egg, which while that track is great too, and maybe I sort of prefer it to A200, especially with how it sounds like a predecessor to what Blackmore would do in Rainbow. But yet I understand why they decided with A200, which is somewhat experimental and, in a way, almost unusual for Deep Purple at this time. It almost has a robotic nature to it, especially with John Lord's vibrant synth key playing. But when the band comes in, especially Ritchie Blackmore, it does end up being a cool rocker and is quite the jam, and with that, it caps the album off, ending a pretty brilliant introduction to the classic Mark III lineup. So, there we have it. The legacy for Byrne is a massive one, and one that was very deserving of such a milestone and legacy to begin with. And so, with that, for all of you who have lived with this album, whether you were young, whether you were there, let's say like the beginning of it, or discovered Deep Purple when you're younger in let's say like the 80s or the 90s, 2000s, whatever, just like me, no matter what, if you had lived with this album for such a long period of time, no matter what, you know what to do. And that means if your thoughts are either positive or negative, you can leave them all down in the comments section below. But if you're one of those who's beginning to venture into this period of the band, then I can't recommend you this Stone Cold classic enough. You have to. You have to. If you're going to venture, even let's say since I focused on Whitesnake Slide It In last week, if you were obviously a fan of Whitesnake and David Coverdale, or just beginning to want to venture into anything he did prior to Whitesnake, obviously you've heard about this album and you didn't pull the punch on, or the trigger. If you didn't pull the trigger on getting Byrne, or starting off with it no matter what, please do. It is worth checking out. So with that, this is Heavy Thrasher saying I'm out, and I'll see you all later. Take care, everyone.